Imagine inheriting tens of millions of dollars but being unable to spend it unless you could prove you were sober. Well, that is exactly what happened to one of the Gilded Age's most infamous party boys. Hi everyone, Ken here. Hit that subscribe button and let's explore this house. In 1856, George Crocker was born in Sacramento, California. He was the second son of Charles Crocker, one of the famed Big Four railroad magnates behind the Transcontinental Railroad. Growing up in the shadow of a railroad empire, young George had a reputation for revelry. In fact, when his father passed away in 1888, George's inheritance came with an unusual string attached. He would only receive a $6 million share if he could stay sober for 5 continuous years. At the time, George was known as one of the most reckless young men in San Francisco, indulging in the freewheeling lifestyle of the era. His father's stipulation was a stern challenge to reform his ways. For a few years, George continued his high-spirited habits, but eventually he accepted the challenge. He checked himself into a sanatorium and began the hard work of proving his sobriety. With his inheritance secured, George moved east to New York City, eager to establish himself among the business and social elite. In 1894, he married Emma Rutherford, a wealthy widow from California who had 3 grown children of her own. The marriage brought George a partner who was already familiar with high society, and together, the Crockers became part of the social world of the Gilded Age. They maintained a mansion at 1 East 64th Street in Manhattan, where Mrs. Crocker gained renown as a glamorous society hostess. It was the age of opulent balls and glittering soirees, and the Crockers were fully invested in that lifestyle. Newspapers and who's who's in America listed George as a prominent figure of the day. Professionally, George took on substantial roles managing and expanding the investments he inherited. He opened a New York office and became involved in a wide range of enterprises, railroads, banks, coal, sugar, and more, essentially shepherding the portfolio of ventures his father had begun. Despite his earlier wild years, George had clearly come into his own as a wealthy and respectable member of the American elite. He wasn't just managing money, he was also adventurous and forward-thinking in his interest. For instance, he helped finance Arctic expeditions by explorer Robert Peary, who in 1906 claimed to have discovered new land near the North Pole and named it Crocker Land in George's honor. It turned out to be a mirage, a polar hoax of sorts, but the good faith gesture showed the breadth of George's engagements in the early 1900s. With this lifestyle came the desire to establish a truly magnificent country estate where he could live and entertain in grand style. That vision would lead him to the pastoral landscapes of Mahwah, New Jersey, and the creation of the architectural masterpiece, Darlington. For the design of his new home, George looked to the grandeur of England's Jacobean manor houses for inspiration. He particularly admired Bramshill House, a 17th century Jacobean prodigy house in Hampshire, England, known for its stately architecture. To bring this vision to life, Crocker hired one of the era's most esteemed architects, James Bright. Bright, along with his partner Henry Bacon, had an impressive resume. They had worked on landmarks like the original Madison Square Garden and would later be known for designing the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. In 1902, Crocker commissioned Bright and Bacon to design a massive 45,000 square foot mansion for the site, modeled closely after the Jacobean style of Bramshill House. The architecture would blend late Gothic and Jacobean Revival elements, executed with American ingenuity and materials. Construction crews began arriving as early as 1902 to improve roads on the property, and by 1903, the ground was broken for the foundation of the new mansion. Over the next 4 years, work proceeded on what locals would simply call the Crocker Mansion. No expense was spared in its making. The building was constructed of Harvard brick and Indiana limestone, giving it the look of an English castle transplanted to New Jersey. As the walls rose, master craftsmen were brought in for the interiors. The finest woodworkers and stone carvers labored over details for years on end. By the time the mansion was finally completed and furnished in 1907, it had cost an astonishing $2 million, a sum equivalent to roughly $70 million today. Stepping inside Darlington in its heyday was like entering a European palace. The design included a majestic great hall that formed the heart of the mansion, a grand reception hall with soaring 30-foot ceilings and rich wood paneling where George and Emma would host lavish parties. In this great hall, Crocker installed one of his most extravagant indulgences, a 45-foot tall Aeolian pipe organ. The dining room was no less impressive. It was finished entirely in glowing California redwood, an homage to Crocker's California roots and a rarity on the East Coast at the time. There were also intimate spaces like a tea room and smoking room, and later accounts mention a billiard room and other recreational spaces. Technologically, the mansion was ahead of its time. Though built in 1907, it included modern conveniences that were cutting edge for the era, a central steam heating system to keep its many rooms warm, electric elevators to whisk residents between floors, and even a telephone switchboard for the estate, a true novelty in an age where phone service was still a luxury. The triumph of completing Darlington was soon met with personal tragedy. Even before the mansion was finished, George's beloved wife Emma fell gravely ill, passing away in 1904 from stomach cancer. Not long after, fate dealt George another cruel hand. In 1907, George himself was also diagnosed with stomach cancer. He passed away just a couple years later in December of 1909 at the age of 53. Childless and having lost the love of his life, George directed that a significant portion of his wealth be used for the public good. In particular, the proceeds from the sale of Darlington and his New York residence were earmarked to fund medical research. As a lasting memorial, the George Crocker Special Research Fund for Cancer Research was established at Columbia University. The first to take up residence in the mansion after the Crocker era was Emerson McMillin, an Ohio-born banker and industrialist who purchased the estate in 1909. McMillin was a self-made millionaire, a magnate in gas and electric utilities, and he eagerly moved into the 75-room mansion, which must have suited his own Gilded Age taste. Then, in 1924, a development syndicate envisioned transforming the estate into a luxury country club and golf course, but these plans never came to fruition. Salvation came from an entirely different quarter in 1926. That year, the Catholic Archdiocese of Newark purchased the Darlington estate. The church found an inspired new use for the grand property. It moved the Immaculate Conception Seminary to Darlington. A group of 53 seminarians and faculty members took up residence in the Crocker mansion. The mansion was soon ringing with the sounds of Latin prayers and theological debates rather than high society chatter. Over the following decades, the estate was adapted to its educational and religious role. In the late 1930s, the Archdiocese undertook major construction on the property to create a true campus for the seminary. They hired the architectural firm of Fanning and Shaw to design new buildings, including dorms and even a chapel. The seminary era of Darlington lasted for nearly 57 years, departing in 1984. Around 2005, what was now known as the Crocker-McMillin mansion made news when it was put up for sale. Finally, in 2008, a buyer emerged. What followed was a multi-year, multi-million-dollar restoration project that breathed new life into the mansion. By 2017, the mansion was back on the market, now proudly advertising it as a fully restored historic masterpiece just 25 miles from Manhattan. In December 2021, the Crocker-McMillin mansion sold for $26 million. However, this tenure too would be short-lived, as the new owner was indicted on federal charges and the property was seized by the federal government in 2023. As of today, it is currently back on the market. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. What did you think about the Crocker-McMillin mansion? Did you have a favorite room? Let me know down below in the comments section, and while you're there, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an exciting episode of This House.